Good morning, Milwaukee Lutheran Church, and welcome to a super very special edition of Sunday morning sermon. I jokingly referred to this as sermon on the road before I took off for vacation, but actually this is more of a sermon on the farm this morning. So let me orient you to where I'm at. First of all, I'm at my dad's farm in Michigan, northeastern Lower Peninsula, Alpena area, and been here for about a week, and I'm going to be here through Tuesday. And so Elena and I are leaving Tuesday morning. I'm dropping her in Appleton, Wisconsin at the airport there. She's going to fly back, and then I will start my drive back to Portland with Madeline, our dog. So I'll probably be back in town around hopefully Friday, maybe Saturday, depending on how the drive goes and how long I want to make my days. So like I said, I'm on the farm. I've talked maybe a little bit about it, but I just wanted to show you some of the highlights. First of all, obviously I'm in a very beautiful setting here. Sun's coming out behind me this morning, and I apologize if there's a lot of noise in the mic. The wind just started blowing right before I started recording, so yeah, it is what it is. But okay, let me see if I can do this. So, here's me. The sun's behind me. Gonna do this. There's one of my dad's many pole barns. Another pole barn. There's the house that he built with his own two hands. And then here's the highlight. This is the climbing wall that he built, which makes all the neighbors think that he's crazy. Pretty nice. Yeah. So this is what we've been doing a lot since we've been here, is going up and down that thing. I can't even fit it in the entire computer screen. And then if we keep panning around, sorry, I'm tilting it the wrong way. There we go. That's my grandma and grandpa's old house. And then, turn my hand. Oh, and here comes the dog. And there's my aunt's house, and there's me. And then there's the dog. Hey, Madeline, good morning. Somebody's going out for a walk right now. Oh, hold on, I got to adjust it again. It's pointing up into the sun. Do you want to come over and say hi? Hey, kiddo. Oh, you're going to knock over my coffee. She's been having a great time here. We went canoeing yesterday, believe it or not, down the Thunder Bay River. And she adored it. There. Now you're not looking directly into the sun. Sorry, I got this funky setup out here that's made up of lawn chairs. All right. So let's just talk about announcements real quick. Trying to think what's going on. I'm in vacation mode, to be honest. So several of you said, "Well, why are you even recording a sermon while you're on vacation?" I'm like, well, that's actually a pretty good question. Why am I recording a sermon? Well, because I can. Number one, this is one of the benefits of doing virtual worship, is that I can frankly record a sermon from just about anywhere. But number two, I'm actually preaching tomorrow at my home congregation, at the congregation that I grew up in, at Tiny Lear Lutheran Church just down the road from here. When they heard that I was coming back into town, they asked if I would be willing to lead the service and preach, so I couldn't say no to that. I literally haven't preached there since I was ordained back in 2009, I think. Might have had a stint in there somewhere, but so that's super cool. Looking forward to that tomorrow. Yeah, and as for the casual clothing, I didn't bring my clericals with me. I'm on vacation, man. So let's talk announcements real quick. So just a reminder that, I'll be back either the 9th or the 10th, but then the 11th, I will be there for sure for our Walking with St. Francis and St. Clair event, which is at 10 a.m. on Sunday morning. Sorry, my mic just tipped over in my lap. 10 a.m. on Sunday morning. I've already described it, so I won't go through that again. But if you're waffling as to whether or not to come, please, absolutely come. It's going to be a blast. I'm really looking forward to it. The weather hopefully won't be super hot. It's at 10 a.m., so I think it's supposed to be maybe 92 that day. But it should be only in the high 70s in the morning, which actually will be perfect. And we'll be under the patio probably anyhow. And then so that's the 11th, and then the next Sunday, the 18th, it will be another recorded worship. And then the 25th will be our semi-annual meeting and our outdoor worship service. So I'm looking forward to seeing y'all. Pray for me for safe travels on the way back. It's a 4-day drive, so yay. That's about it in terms of that stuff. Y'all got anything? Probably not. Okie dokie. Yeah, I guess I can read the gospel. So the gospel for this week is Mark 6, which is interesting because, and you may have noticed this, we already actually had a piece of this back, I want to say during Easter. Does that sound right? Yeah, maybe Easter 2 or Easter 3. We had just the beginning of this passage, and now we get the whole thing. So it's Mark 6 verses 1 through 13. All right, this is the gospel. He left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, "Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Then Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house." And he could do no deed of power there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. Then he went about among the villages teaching. He called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He ordered them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not to put on 2 tunics. He said to them, "Wherever you enter a house, stay there until you leave the place. If any will not welcome you and they refuse to hear you, as you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them." So they went out and proclaimed that all should repent. They cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and cured them. The gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I forgot to mention ahead of time that I don't have my editing suite with me, so I can't throw in all the nice overlays. I can't put the text up on the screen and all that jazz. So this is just going to be one long chunk. But if you want to pause and go back and read that passage on your own, feel free to do it. I know for me, sometimes it's helpful to be able to look at it with my own eyes. And I don't know how good the audio quality is. And I just noticed the wind's picking up. Great. So let's talk Mark 6. So like I said, this passage we already had in part. We had the first piece about Jesus not being welcome in his hometown. And now we get tacked on the second piece. So let's place it in the context. This passage comes directly after last week's passage. So we had the end of Mark 5 last week. And it comes directly before we hear of John's death, John the Baptist's death at the hands of Herod. So this is placed essentially kind of smack dab in the middle of the Galilean narrative in the Gospel of Mark. And something to keep in mind here is that Mark 3 through Mark 5 is functionally just Jesus going around and doing healings and teaching in synagogues. So that's kind of the piece where he's bouncing back and forth across the Sea of Galilee and visiting villages and stuff like that. But we ended last week with the healing of 2 people, the healing of the little girl, Jairus' daughter, and then the healing of the woman who was hemorrhaging. And then today, Jesus goes back to Nazareth, spends some time there, and then leaves and then commissions his disciples to go out. When I've read this passage before, I've always been struck by the almost kind of hostility that is expressed regarding Jesus in his hometown. And I don't know if it's just the way that Mark writes it, but one of the things that I would encourage you to do in the reading of this, but I think is important, is to read this passage not through the lens of Jesus the Messiah being rejected, but Jesus the man who grew up, did mischief, was a human being in the town of Nazareth. And what's happening is you have essentially a conflict where Jesus the Messiah is encountering the memory that exists in his hometown's mind, which is Jesus the human, Jesus the boy, Jesus, the one that toilet papered the neighbor's house. I'm making things up, but I think you understand what I'm saying. Is that they still see him as see him as that 8-year-old boy, that 15-year-old teenager, and it's hard to shake that memory. And I was thinking about this, and it's ironic, since I'm preaching on this passage tomorrow at my home congregation, as I remember all the way back in 2009, I had just graduated seminary. And to be fair, I think, that would have made me 26, I think, 26 or 27 when I graduated. And I was just about to begin my new gig at my church in Fort Wayne. And we organized my ordination here at my home congregation. And it was a fantastic event. The things that I remember very clearly was the fact that Jim Stuck, who was the bishop of the IK Synod, the Indiana-Kentucky Synod at that time, drove all the way up to this tiny, tiny little town in northeast Michigan, to this tiny, tiny little church to preside over my ordination, which I thought was pretty awesome and really endeared me to him at that time. But then also my internship supervisor, Dennis, flew all the way out from Southern California to preach at my ordination, which was also pretty fantastic. And those two things stuck out in my memory. And then the other thing was, this was 4 years after my mom's aneurysm, and so I got to preside over communion for the first time for my mother, which was a pretty powerful experience. But the other thing that sticks out in my head is, of course, pretty much all my home congregation came, but what stuck out in my head was how much they still saw me as little Jesse. That little, white, my hair was super blonde, almost white when I was young, and so they remember this little, blonde-headed, I wasn't really much of a mischief maker, but, they're blonde-headed little boy. And reading this text and thinking about that, it reminds me so much of how we develop an image of a person and how that image is built on or based on our experiences of that person, and how hard it is to change that image, especially when we don't see them for a while. Maybe this is something that you can relate to. You've had friends or family who have, departed, gone, left, moved, whatever, or you've moved, either way. And, or maybe, it's a similar experience where you left your hometown at a young age or later in life, and you spent some time away, and you reconnect with people that you knew from there, and you realize how much both of you have changed. And my experience has been, and especially because I kind of left straight out of college, and I have a lot of friends who stayed here in Alpena and the surrounding area, how different of people we are. We don't have a whole lot in common anymore. And that's not to say that either of us have gone a bad direction. It's just we've become different people. And who I am has been shaped by where I've gone and where I've lived and the different things I've done and the different people I've met. And maybe you can relate to that, So that's what's going on here. And what we see then is this conflict that arises out of it, where because of that, because of their memories of Jesus, the boy, it is functionally impossible for them to understand Jesus as Messiah, or Jesus, in this case, not really Messiah yet, more Jesus as rabbi and miracle worker. And they question that, right? There's that wonderful line where they're like, is this not Jesus, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon, and are not his sisters with us? Pause there for a second. So, we don't often talk about this, but, Jesus had a family, including many siblings, which, might seem weird to think about, but, would not have, that would have been, actually, it would have been strange for him not to have siblings. They had large families in that day. One other thing to notice here is, Joseph is not mentioned by name. So there's some debate around this. One of the common things is that because he's not mentioned by name, it's assumed that he has passed at this point, that Joseph is deceased. So he is the carpenter. You don't name the dead, okay? So he's listed as the carpenter here, which means that Mary is a widow, and she's probably being taken care of by her adult children. So that's just kind of like an interesting aside there. But then, so that's what they say. Is this not Jesus, the boy that we grew up with? And then it switches over and Jesus responds to them. And he says this kind of weird line. He's like, prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house. There's a translational clarity that could help here. Honor is a weird word. We don't live in an honor society anymore, and I'm not going to really get into the details of what that's about. But like I said, the translation here actually helps. So the Greek word here is atimos, and in this case, the A is the alpha, it's the negative particle. So it's similar in English where we use A as a negation. So like atypical or apolitical or atheist, it's non-theist or non-political or non-typical. So in this case, atimos is non-timos, and timos actually comes from is the root word time, which means value. So, here comes the dog again. Hello. Where's Alen? Go find Alen. Okay. So time means, I lost my train of thought here. Dog interruption. If I was editing this, I would put a neat little graphic in here. So time means value. So what this really means, what Jesus is saying here is prophets are not without value except in their hometown. So what he's remarking on is that there really isn't, the people in Nazareth don't see the value of him as a prophet because they can't, right? And this is what we've already discussed, is they see him according to who he was, not who he is here. But then I also really get a kick out of these next few verses, because there's this commentary from Mark, and he could do no deed of power there except that he had laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. Okay, if you don't read this as sarcasm, Lord help you, because this is one of the most sarcastic lines in Mark there is. Because who would name healing people miraculously as not a deed of power? So how I read this whole section is, Jesus reacting and just kind of lamenting. It's not angry. He's just kind of saying, yeah, they're never going to see me as Jesus the prophet or Jesus the Messiah because they can't get over me as Jesus, Jesus the human being, Jesus the boy. And they don't see what he's doing in its full context, because they remark ahead of time. They're like, who is this that is doing these things, that's teaching in the synagogue and doing these healings? And, it's sarcasm. Yeah, I couldn't do any deeds of power except heal sick people. That's just my humor. Okay, so let's skip to the second passage because this is ultimately where I want to end up. Or the second part of the passage, I should say. So after this encounter in the hometown, there's just this one line in verse 6, and he went out among the villages teaching. So he takes off with his disciples and begins to do what he was doing again. So he's teaching and healing and casting out unclean spirits. And then we get Mark's commissioning. So Jesus gathers the 12 and he sends them out 2 by 2. And the text says he gives them authority over the unclean spirits. Just a kind of a side note here, an important piece about this is that this is kind of a blanket statement for healing and casting out unclean spirits, because how Hebrew people would have understood the world of medicine is potentially kind of similar to like Middle Ages, bad humors. But there was a suspicion that many diseases and ailments were caused by uncleanliness and or unclean spirits, which is why in last week's narrative we have this woman who's had been hemorrhaging for 12 years, and she would have been unclean according to temple practices, not only because of the bleeding, but because of the assumption that her illness is a result of an unclean spirit. So when he says you have power over unclean spirits, they have the power to heal and the power to cast out, which is why at the end of this passage they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and cured them. Okay, so he gathers them, sends them out 2 by 2, and of course I've talked on this before, but I'll mention it again. Notice how he equips them. So he sends them out with only a staff, a tunic, and sandals, nothing else. So no food, no money, and not 2 tunics, which that's a little interesting aside. So similarly to Michigan, in Israel, it gets very warm by day and very cold by night. And so you would want two tunics to keep you cold or to use as a blanket during the night. So he sends them out essentially, and again, I've talked about this, he sends them out extremely vulnerable. He sends them out with really no protection from the elements and no way to feed themselves. In the past, I have preached on this state of vulnerability as being important to our understanding of this passage, and that holds true. And so, one of the things I would encourage you to think about is what this speaks to, how this speaks to our concept of discipleship and evangelism, and how often we see evangelism as being in a position of power and teaching somebody or converting somebody to believe the way we do out of a position of power. But that's not the model of discipleship that appears anywhere in the gospel narrative. In the Synoptics and in John, to be fair, the model of discipleship that's presented is one of vulnerability. So you go out relying on the grace and relying on the goodwill of the people that you're being sent to. You don't go out in a position of power intending to forcefully convert or persuade or convince. You're going out, and again, what Jesus commissions them specifically to do is he doesn't even really commission them to teach. He commissions them to practice healings and cast out unclean spirits. It's the model of discipleship here is closer to Doctors Without Borders than it is to missionaries as we conceive of them. So he sends them out vulnerable, says to them, finally, wherever you enter a place, stay there until you leave the place. Okay, let's pause and talk about this for a second. So place in this case is a little bit vague. What I've always taken it to mean, what I assume it means, is place being the town or the village or the geographical location. So when he says, whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave the place, what he means by that is essentially you find a place to stay in that village and you don't hop around. You stay with that family until you leave, or you stay in that household until you leave. And there would be a really interesting conversation as to why that is. And honestly, it would be all conjecture on my part. But one of the questions that I wonder about it is, was Jesus intentionally asking his disciples to try and make long-term relationships in the town that they visited? I don't know, but it's something interesting to wonder about. So he says, wherever you enter a house, stay there until you leave the place. And then we get this piece that ultimately arrives at our crux point, our conflict point. If any place will not welcome you, and they refuse to hear you, as you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them. I know I've preached on this before, but I say that a lot, and I should not say that a lot because I should always assume that people are hearing this for the first time. But it's hard for me to forget that I've talked about this before. So let's let's talk about this. Because ultimately, this is kind of where I want to round out today. Because in the first half of the passage, we get Jesus essentially being rejected by his hometown. And now in this part of the passage, we get Jesus coaching his disciples on how to handle rejection by the people that they're going to serve. So he says, if any place will not welcome you and they refuse to hear you, as you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them. So let's talk about what this means. It is easy and tempting to think of this shaking off the dust as a protest or essentially a condemnation to the people that were there. And you can almost visualize what this might look like, right? It looks like, again, forgive my imagination. What I see is like the old Western where the cowboy, walks out of the saloon, takes off from the town that refuses to welcome him in, or, maybe there's banditry or something like this, and, spits on the ground and angrily, tromps off and hops on his horse and rides away into the sunset. In other words, it's very much an image of reproach, condemnation, and even, I don't know, I had a third word there, but I forgot it. But again, as with all things biblical, context is extremely important. So hospitality in Hebrew society was everything. You were not called upon to provide hospitality just to people that you knew, but there was this encouragement to provide and offer hospitality even to the stranger. And it's biblical, so that's Levitical. There are passages in Leviticus that talk about your obligation of hospitality to foreigners and strangers. And there's actually some great kind of proof texts for this in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the story in Judges 19 of the Levite and the concubine, wherein we take passages that have often been used as weapons against LGBTQIA plus issues, weapons against concepts of homosexuality, but really they're not about that at all. They're about hospitality. So the great sin that the great anger, that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah hold against Lot, who welcomes Abraham into their midst. Against Lot, never mind. Anyways, the great sin is that they get ticked off because Lot offers hospitality to foreigners, okay? Lot is merely doing what his understanding of hospitality calls him to do. And so the great critique against the town is not about homosexuality or anything sexual. It's about the inability of that community to provide hospitality to strangers. And not just inability to provide hospitality, but the hostility that they show. So, going back to what I was talking about, one of the primary forms of hospitality when offering it to foreigners or to travelers is the first thing that you do when you invite them into your home is you offer them 2 bowls of water, one with which to wash their hands and their face, and one with which to wash their feet, and then a towel to dry their feet. And, of course, the reason this is because this was a dusty area. I mean, it's, if not desert, it's high desert. But also, when you're traveling, walking the roads, you're not just walking, again, not to get gross, but there are animal products, there are all kinds of, other things besides plain dirt that are on the road. And so, as you can imagine, one of the first things that you might want to do after a long day of walking is to wash your stinking feet. And I got my sandals on. Let me tell you, my feet get really dirty. And one of the best feeling things in the world when I come inside is to wash my feet off. So, what Jesus is saying when he says to shake the dust off your feet is essentially to remind the household that rejected you of their lack of hospitality towards you. So in other words, it's to remind them of their obligation of hospitality, which is not something that Jesus is proclaiming. It's a biblical thing. So like if we were to boil this all down, Jesus sends his disciples out vulnerable, reliant upon the hospitality of strangers, which is biblical. It's in their law. So in other words, Jesus is calling upon these villages and these towns, not directly, but via the disciples, to remember their, essentially oath of hospitality towards the traveler, towards the stranger. And then when they reject you, is the shaking off of the dust upon their feet is not necessarily a condemnation, but it's a reminder of their failure to live up to those expectations. Okay. So my video is almost at 30 minutes, which, to be fair, there's a fair bit of introduction. But let's try and round this out and talk about the impact upon us in the modern era. So for me, there are two sides to this. One side is if you identify with the villagers. One side is if you identify with the disciples. And I think both can be and are informative to us. So first, let's look at it from the perspective of those providing hospitality. One of the great takeaways from this text for me is that in this moment, Jesus is using the commissioning of the disciples not just as a training moment or a teaching moment for his disciples, but also to make a point about what his mission and ministry is about. And what's fascinating, if you think about it, is in this case, he's essentially being functionally, biblically conservative. And again, dissociate that from any understanding of politics or modern progressive, conservative metrics. But what I mean by that is that Jesus is calling the people of that region back to an interpretation or an understanding or a reading of the Levitical law, which is core to their belief. So in many ways, what he is calling the people to do is to come back to an orthodoxy of law following, which is something that we don't really associate Jesus and might be weird to think about. But what he's doing is he's saying, listen, y'all need to remember what it means to be the people of God. And in this case, whoops, sorry about that. In this case specifically, being the people of God means providing hospitality to travelers, to foreigners, to strangers. Okay? And so I'm sending out my disciples as a way of not testing it per se, but as teaching you what the importance of that hospitality is. So for us in 2021, especially in a political and social climate that is rife with conflict and division, we as Jesus followers are reminded to, but I would even be more forceful in saying we are compelled to practice radical hospitality, in that we are compelled to remember that Jesus asks us to welcome in, to care for, and to act with kindness towards the foreigner, the stranger, the traveler. Those categories are very much first century Israel. I would give you guys some homework, give us all some homework in thinking about what categories that might include for us in 2021. So what might the modern day equivalent be of the foreigner, the traveler, or the stranger? Okay, so hospitality. Number two, so let's think about it from the flip side in terms of the disciples. So I already talked about how this modern model of discipleship is one of vulnerability. So that's a key piece here. You're being asked as followers of Jesus, when you practice discipleship, and again, discipleship is not necessarily a one-to-one equivalent of evangelism. Discipleship is literally following Jesus and following the teachings of Jesus. In your discipleship, you have to remember that you are never commissioned in a position of power. So in other words, if you find yourself in a situation where you get the sense that you are speaking down to, or you are speaking from a position of power into somebody who's in a vulnerable position, try to remember that that is not the dynamic that Jesus would prefer in terms of your gospel speaking or in terms of your discipleship. And we could actually get into great depth about why that is, but just real quickly, think about the times that you have been in a conversation with somebody who's trying to not necessarily change your mind, but maybe convince you of something, and not even convince you of something. Think about the different times that you have encountered a stranger, for lack of a better example. Whether it's a person a salesperson, or just somebody. Where do you feel most comfortable? Do you feel most comfortable when you're in your home, right? So let's go back to somebody knocks on your door. Do you feel most comfortable in that position, or do you feel most comfortable when you are potentially in a foreign town, let's say middle of South Dakota, right, and a stranger approaches you and wants to talk to you? Probably, if you're like me, you feel most comfortable in your own home. Now, granted, there might be some anxiety about wanting to get over this interaction so that the stranger gets off your porch. But my point being here is that people are very, very, very unlikely to hear anything from you if you put them in a position of vulnerability or weakness. Furthermore, we shouldn't do it just because it's a good strategy, but because this is the way that Jesus would have us do discipleship. I think that it's not just about our percentage of success, but it's also about how we understand what we're doing. I think much of what we conceptualize as evangelism and or missionary work in 2021 is modeled after colonial and or late Middle Ages models of missionary work, which is we are the fire bringers. We are the Prometheus, bringing fire to the unenlightened natives. You know, and to put it in racial terms, we're the enlightened white people bringing the message to, dark-skinned people, dark-skinned savages. Thankfully, we've moved past that to a certain extent, but I think that model still pervades our understandings of evangelism, even when we think about evangelizing to our community around us. Evangelism is not about going out from a position of power. In other words, me having the right answers and educating somebody who is in the dark. Rather, based on the model that we have here, it's about going out, making yourself vulnerable, and providing kindness, healing, and comfort, aid in whatever form that we can, even and especially when it means that, again, not to repeat myself, but where we find ourselves in a situation where we are not the ones in power. So ultimately, here would be the question that I would attach to that, something for you to think about is, and granted, if I bring up the word evangelism or discipleship, it can be a scary word for people to think about. But for us as Christians, as followers of Jesus in the 21st century, in a society where Christianity really can be a four-letter word at times and can be threatening in and of itself, what's our discipleship strategy? Or to put it a different way, how do we carry out this command of Jesus? Or how do we see ourselves being sent out? Is it door knocking to try and bring the light of Christ to unconverted non-believers? Or is it leaving our places of comfort and safety? Cancel out the word safety. Jesus never calls us, well, that's not entirely true either. I was just about to say Jesus never calls us to risk our well-being, but, actually he kind of does. But I would say for the purposes of what we're talking about, let's just leave it at leaving your places of comfort and venturing into different contexts. And again, not being the Promethean example of we're bringing the light of wisdom to these unenlightened folks, but rather we are bringing our ability to do healing and to provide aid and provide help. And at the end of the day, the most important part is that we are ultimately relying on the hospitality or the welcome of those who are there. We're not going in with power over. Okay, I feel like I've talked long enough for today, and no need for me to make this truncated video as long as one of my worship recordings. But long story short for you this week, God's blessings on all of you. I hope that you're all doing well. I hope everybody survived that ridiculous heat. Please don't hate me too much for having missed most of it here in the balmy weather of Michigan. But I'll be back in a week or so. You will get a similar recording to this for next Sunday because I just won't have time to put together a worship video when I get back on Saturday. But you will get another one of these. It will actually be a sermon on the road because I'll probably record it somewhere in either South Dakota or Montana. So look forward for this coming next week. God's blessings to all y'all, and see you soon.